Mega Man Issue 38. The story starts with a few pages being wasted on X finding the remains of what turns out to be a weapons platform. It flies towards the surface, having somehow not run out of energy in 100 years, even though it was running the whole time underground. X gets told that someone pulled the emergency alarm, and eventually X says the giant's weapon doesn't seem interested in the tourists because it's heading straight for the city. I see why the writer thought this would be a more interesting start than Mega Man fighting another giant mecha, because that was so overdone that I wasn't looking forward to the issue. So Kane calls Sigma and gets told to see if there's anything in the dig site that could tell the heroes about the ancient Maverick. And somehow Kane doesn't like the idea of it being called a Maverick. Why would he assume it's only going to the city to offer the mayor milk and cookies or something? And why did Vile still have his name even when he was one of the Maverick Hunters? Who would name their Maverick Hunter robot Vile? Sigma tells Zero and Vile to move out. X gets thrown back by an explosion again, because apparently he's helpless against giant robots. And Zero helps him up. Zero and Vile add some charm by thinking that taking on the mecha will be fun and exciting. And Zero tells people to take on the mecha from a distance, and tells X to check on Kane. Then it flashes back to the past where Mega Man's helmet gets cracked, and he eventually gets told to put a code in the command console. He tells Pharaoh Man he needs covering fire. Mega Man thanks him and puts in the code, which predictably doesn't shut the robot down, and instead opens the door to the outside. Wily lies that it was an accident and says it's been years since he worked there. Yeah, but it'd be more likely that he'd give him a code that wouldn't do anything than give him one of the very few potential codes that did. Because you can't memorize codes that long. I could buy Dr. Light and Mega Man's wishful thinking keeping them from figuring out Wily here, but everyone else should know he's doing this on purpose. The terminal gets blown up, a page gets wasted since we already know Wily's plans, and Mega Man tells his friends to use the robot's legs to break its line of fire, but that was a waste of time because they can't anyways. He uses a charge shot to create some rubble, trapping the robot in the lab with them. Then convoluted writing happens to Xander where he sees into the future in plenty of different ways to the point of seeing the end of issue 20. He hand waves away that he escapes into the time stream. If he got shot at the same time he went into the time machine, he'd be hurt right now. How could the inventor of the time machine be so unaware of its capability that he didn't think it'd do this to him? He hears Base wondering if shooting the giant anomaly would erase Mega Man from the timeline, and somehow assumes that them shooting it would be a bad idea, and somehow he screams, despite being unharmed in the next panel. Then he gets shown worlds collide and says he can't stand it, and gets thrown onto a road, because all of a sudden now he's tangible. He sees the giant weapon Zero's fighting, and assumes that the robot apocalypse is happening, despite the fact that robots are fighting it. So really, you should just think it's another time where someone like Wily is trying to take over a city with a giant machine. He's only seeing a few robots, so this is too early to jump to that conclusion. The robots are clearly humans' only line of defense against this thing. What, would he act like this in response to a Wily mecha? The story ends there when I expected Mega Man to win in this issue because the comic wasted space on Xander's scene. The story is a good example of the biggest problem with Flynn's writing, that his pacing is way too slow, making the stories especially boring for comics most of the time. His second worst problem is he's got no restraint in who gets the idiot's ball, making me think of every character as a moron. And his third worst problem is the lack of creativity, but this is the one comic where he is creative, which puts the other problems to the forefront, showing that even if he was as creative as Penders, he'd still be a worse writer to me by making characters more stupid than he did. But even then, I have a hard time remembering the idiot balls in this comic. I think the only real idiot plot is when Wily kidnapped Roll, because he should have known sending his robots to her house would do just as well and be faster. Even at his best, he still makes a boring comic, while the Jetsons comics have fast pacing and are more interesting, not repetitive like all of his different comics where they constantly fight robots. Mega Man Issue 39. Some panels are wasted, and Brightman lampshades the fact that there's nothing he can do to fight. Wily's deleted the call records of every Robot Master called to help out, as it's obvious that the call was ended right after it was started. Even though he should know that the Robot Masters would all tell Dr. Light that they were called for a split second and hung up on him, which would get him mad at Wily. Logically, this would be so suspicious that it would prevent the Mega Man 3 adaptation. Logically, he wouldn't bother taking this risk because he wouldn't think he could get away with it. And besides, if he's supposed to be confident, then he would think that in the amount of time it'd take for any of those Robot Masters to get to Mega Man, the Wily Walker would have won before they got there. Dr. Light tells Roll to see if there's a converter in there, and she calls him Sir instead of Dad, which is forced because Mega Man got away with calling him Dad. It shows him that she found one. He tells her to get some bolts, and she says they're going through bolts so much that they're going to become even more valuable than money around here. Somehow Consack insists that Brightman is fine, even though he can't do anything violent. The fact that he made him makes it impossible to believe he didn't make Breakman capable of fighting when he did that for Pharaoh Man, which Wily even points out. Somehow Consack just says that he weaponized Pharaoh Man to protect him, and yet this is somehow different. When he should say that Pharaoh Man needs a way to protect himself from the traps he deactivates in pyramids, which is what I thought he would say. Well, Brightman didn't need to be able to fight. Dr. Light says Wily's right that giving him weapons would be a good idea, even though I'd assume he wouldn't be able to send him the weapon modification remotely. Consack says he hates the idea of weaponizing every Robot Master because he's afraid of what kind of future that could create, which only makes sense because in the real world that wouldn't be allowed for being too dangerous. But in the Mega Man world, it's better to weaponize every Robot Master so that they could fight against Wily's robots on a moment's notice, especially since most of the Robot Masters at any given point won't be taken over by Wily, so his robots would be outnumbered. And then it flashes forward to the X series, where it somehow takes an entire page for Zero to give the order to fire at a giant robot, which recognizes Zero as being made by Wily and ignores him, which naturally just causes Vile to assume that it's underestimating Zero in favor of the guy with the laser shooter on his back. And when Zero fights it, it changes its mind. Zero again thinks he's having fun, and X sees some boulders arbitrarily heading for Kane and shoots them. Kane feels guilty about what he released and finds something that reveals that the giant machine has chemical weapons. And X figures out that if the hunters blow the machine up, they'll get released who knows how far. Someone apologizes to X for explaining why he can't call Zero, so X warns Zero not to destroy the machine and tells him what he found out. So Vile shoots until rubble lands in the machine from the highway getting damaged, and some cars have to skid to a stop, causing Vile's teammates to call him out on potentially killing someone, even though he didn't see any cars get destroyed or flipped over. They just stopped. Vile naturally points out that the Maverick nearby would kill a lot more people than some people. Zero tells X to help anyone hurt and calls on others to do the same. X nudges someone's car to an area that's more structurally secure. A robot tells him there's a human over there, and X thanks him. And Xander falls, and the fact that he gets caught by a robot makes it all the more frustrating that he's going to keep his hatred of all technology. From his perspective, he's just being rational and pragmatic by thinking that just because one robot saved him, doesn't mean that most robots aren't a liability. And X figures out from the logo on its eye patch that he's Emerald Spears. And I guess X is assuming Xander's crazy, because someone asks Xander if he's gonna behave, and he somehow decides to talk to him antagonistically, he gets handcuffed. Why was he that stupid? He should have known he wasn't going to get hurt. X thanks the robot for handcuffing him, and somehow Xander assumes the humans around him are on his side, instead of the type of people who'd think he's crazy for making a speech like he's their leader who could stop the robots from taking over. And then he disappears. Kane says he can't read some tiny text on a hologram, but Sigma has better eyesight than him because he's a robot, and Kane's an old man. When Kane angsts again, Sigma puts his hand on his shoulder. I don't know why he's being written to be nicer than he has to be when he has nothing to gain from it when he's evil at this point. And then when Vile considers blowing one of the giant robot's legs off, Zero tells him not to use explosives because it could cause dangerous chemicals to leak out of it that way. But he's still shooting at it. And how else does he expect it to get stopped if they aren't allowed to fight it in any way? Mega Man Issue 40. A few pages are wasted with the giant robot conveniently letting X's allies talk for no reason. In the first page, it arms its chemical warheads. Why doesn't it launch them right away? Is that remotely realistic with that level of technology? Then it flashes back to the past, where Mega Man gets told by Dr. Light to modify Bright Man while Pharaoh Man protects them. Mega Man only has to open his back panel and uses his hands to reroute a lot of his output, which makes him lose power to his arm light. Wily gives him some more instructions. Roll pets Rush, and Dr. Light reassures her that he'll be fine, and Rush warps and runs to Pharaoh Man carrying a green floppy disk thing. Pharaoh Man gets hit by a falling rock. I guess there's always an actual chance of the Robot Masters besides Mega Man being too damaged to continue the fight, so there's a point in mentioning when they get hit, but I still feel like they have plot armor. Mega Man's conveniently able to send energy from his hand to give Bright Man the Flash Stopper power, even though Dr. Light never thought he'd need to be able to send electricity coding from his hand, because Wily's been harmless for months. So Bright Man gives the Wily Walker a system failure. But eventually it turns out to be something that would be temporary if Mega Man didn't attach the disabler to the wiring from an access panel. Then Mega Man nearly falls with the Wily Walker, and Pharaoh Man catches him. He thanks him, and Bright Man asks everyone if they're alright. Pharaoh Man thinks they should cave in the chasm to trap the Wily Walker underground after it fell in there. Naturally, Mega Man doesn't want to just leave it down there. Dr. Light says they can't excavate it, and he thinks they wouldn't be able to stop it if it came back online, even though he hasn't tried using all of the Robot Masters against it at once. So if Wily did make something that Dr. Light thinks Mega Man couldn't defeat, why doesn't he ever make the Wily Walker again in an adventure where he wouldn't have Bright Man's best power? Why doesn't he tell a Robot Master to make it? I guess he'll never have the resources or time to make it, considering how big it is. Dr. Light says he sent a recorded warning for the situation and compiled all of Wily's data and put it in there. So he tells Mega Man to throw it towards the Wily Walker and hope that the future can destroy it. Then the story shows Stern again, and when he says he's been shot, he just says it's a part of his collection. It's a badass response, but again it makes me wonder why this is in a kids' comic when even Sonic didn't go this far. I hate that he says sci-fi garbage. Then Xander comes back, conveniently in the exact same place where he went into the time machine, even though every time he was sent to the future, he wasn't still in this building. Stern points out how convenient it is that the place he was sent to already handcuffed him for them. The scientist asks Xander what he saw, and it's too bad he's just vague. I hope he eventually told him exactly what he saw. It'd make no sense if he didn't, because thinking they'll think I'm crazy never stopped him before. In the future, Sigma's shown cutting parts of the Wily Walker, so that's why Sigma's being considered the bigger threat. The robot was surprisingly smart by magically knowing right away that the Z-Saver was a threat to it. Then when Sigma gets attacked but is in silhouette to ruin the catharsis, Zero steals the sword to make the robot come crashing down, and politely apologizes for borrowing the sword. Sigma tells me he did good work and advises him to get a saber too. That wouldn't make sense if he was planning to become the big bad of the series even back then. Why would he give such vital advice to what he should know would be his future enemy and nothing but? X then grabs a part of the giant's robot. Sigma attacks it and smirks, which is confusing because he didn't get more evil from all of the other times he attacked that thing. And this was made before Mega Man 1, so it couldn't have the Zero virus in it. Zero shows concern for X's well-being and calls him Buddy with his hand on his shoulder. Sigma calls Hunter HQ and tells them to have robots brought in to manage the area, and a toxin specialist as well. Zero tells X he did good, and that being a hunter is about protecting people. Vile doesn't have to point out that X only called to the experts and took some pot shots at the giant's robot, and so he doesn't take him seriously. You could call Zero's attacking just as much pot shots. But he did do something vital to help. Sigma makes himself look good again by calling out Vile on risking people's lives blowing up an overpass. And Vile naturally points out that if he didn't, they would have been fighting the robot in the middle of the city. When he calls the human Squishy, Sigma points out that robots are superior in almost every way, which makes Zero and X look at each other in concern. But I'm surprised that he said almost, which is true if they still can't eat and can be reprogrammed. It sure makes him thinking robots are superior forced. He covers up by saying that their superiority is why it's up to them to protect the humans. He tells X and Zero they did a great job, and they both thank him. Kane runs up to him from a car asking if he's alright, and X says Kane shouldn't be here near chemical weapons. Sigma says they'll be neutralized, and Zero tells X he should get repaired, helping him walk. They warp away, and both Kane and Sigma look annoyed, but it's a waste of a panel because it's not because Kane is now suspicious of Sigma. Sigma's response to the idea that Zero forgot all of his past is that he's incomplete. More panels are wasted until Mega Man reassures his family that he's been through worse. And for once, Contact looks confident, and Brightman apologizes for accidentally damaging Pharaohman. Somehow, Dr. Light still has a home phone, and Rosie bores me before saying that the robots from 4 of the networked asteroids from that space station project have gone offline. Dr. Light's somehow dumb enough to ask why she isn't contacting somebody else than him for this, even though obviously his robot masters are the best thing for combat in the world to know, and space isn't under anyone's jurisdiction. Then Stern naturally glares at Rosie for illegally talking on a phone while driving. For once, this Mary Sue shows a flaw by not taking him seriously. But it's not good enough, because it seems like we're not supposed to take it seriously. She at least says she'll hang up before she gets on the road. But just being in the parking lot isn't an excuse, because either way she's distracted enough that she could crash into a car. And the story eventually ends by showing that Xander's wasting his time for no reason talking to his cellmate. How is he already in prison instead of jail? He would already have a prison uniform because he just got arrested and hasn't gone to trial yet. This issue is about Mega Man eventually opening the door out of the room with the wrong command code, and then trapping himself with the giant robot. And it doesn't get to show him defeated because the story wastes comic space on Xander somehow seeing a bunch of different time periods, rather than just being sent to the point where Zero fought with it. It's needlessly complicated and confusing that Xander goes through this rather than simply being sent back in time, or just seeing the future, and that makes it convoluted. Surprisingly, this issue doesn't have Mega Man or Zero defeat the giant machine they're fighting. Yet again, it's an example of how slow the pacing is. It just feels ridiculous on a meta level that they aren't done already, when Mega Man defeating giant machines is really old hat, and it certainly doesn't take so long to do it that it'd actually take more than one issue. Whether it's the games or the comic, where he always takes only 3 hits at most to win. The story gets padded out by Xander taking forever to warp home. It's pointless to have him get caught by X if he's not going to give up because of that, and it's pointless to have him find out the Emerald Spear still exists in the future when he had no chance of giving up anyways. The only thing not boring about this unappealingly uncreative story is Viles being mistreated because he's willing to risk people's lives to destroy something that'd take a lot more lives if it weren't stopped. This issue is about Sigma defeating the Wily Walker with a saber and dealing the final blow, and Brightman stunning the Wily Walker before letting it fall because Wily told Mega Man how to upgrade Brightman with just his hands, which can send electricity from them to recode a robot, even though Dr. Light never thought he'd need to get to do that. So that's a Deus Ex Machina, and I feel like all of the efforts to attack the thing were just pointless because the only thing that mattered was the final hit, like early Sonic X. The future Wily Walker feels a bit like that too. I'm just relieved that the arc's over. It's not creative to base it around a giant robot fight.